9:04 a.m. As a reminder, all member, oh, we don't, do we have anyone virtual yet? And I'll skip that reminder. Executive Director Ross, would you please take roll?
Sure. Member Ruddles?
Present.
Dr. Canto? Not here. Member Chair Clark?
Here.
Dr. Durden is not with us today. Member Haley?
Here.
Member Meyerson? Member Overton?
Present.
Member Palmer? Member Sanchez?
Here.
Member Shepard?
Here.
And Member Vaughn? Not with us. Chair Clark, you have a quorum?
Thank you. So for the first item on our agenda, item 1, we have the results for the 2024 state assessment. They were recently released, so I'd like the subcommittee to briefly review the trend data, and we have those up on the slide there for you. One want to, John, do you want me to just talk about sort of the trend that we're seeing? So overall, this is broken up by category, but the third grade overall score for all students went down 2 percentage points to 39%. So that's that highly proficient and proficient, the orange and blue together for 2024 would be the passing rate for all students. And you can see the by far the minimally proficient category is the highest, where 50% of our students are scoring. So just a reminder, sort of, we had been making some nice movement in the past 3 years since the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, of decreasing minimally proficient and seeing some movement there. So we've stalled some of that momentum, and this is why the work of this subcommittee is so important, and kind of this anchor, I think a good anchor for today's conversation and our guest speaker. Anybody notice anything else that you wanted to, or any questions you have about this? This again scans over multiple different assessments that sort of pretty much, have correlated. So, but you can see we have work ahead.
Yeah. Just a few quick questions. Is this based on K through 3, or sort of 3 through 8 ELA test that is taken in the spring? Okay.
Yep. The third grade ELA assessment test.
And may I also assume that students that are in third grade for spring 2024, were those our COVID kids that started in kindergarten in 2019, 2020?
So these would be the kids that were four-year-olds at the beginning of the pandemic. So they weren't quite yet in kindergarten, and they were probably kids that had the least amount of access to early learning opportunities. And but this is the spring of last year, third grade would have been 4 years old when the pandemic started. Is that helpful? So they weren't entering kindergarten.
So they were pre-K age.
They were pre-K.
So their first kindergarten year would have been 2021?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I'm curious, Chair Clark or Executive Director Ross, have you heard of any either statewide initiatives or studies where there's been an intensive effort just in one grade, in the sense of like, we're going to just like catch this group up, so we're not dealing with it like every year, because that part is so hard, of like to catch a kid, to ensure every single school is growing kids by 1.3 years every year. Is that harder than everybody is focused on just the second graders or just the third graders? Just sort of curious if there's any data or analysis on that.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, I'm not aware of a single grade focus. As obviously from the subcommittee, there's a K-3 focus, but to my knowledge, there wasn't like a line in the sand where they said like, hey, this fourth grade class was the COVID class. We're going to really zoom in on them. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been massive efforts, as you know, as a school leader, between, high dosage tutoring and all those elements that we know help kids catch up. But to my knowledge, no, there hasn't been a single grade focus. In Arizona, I'm not aware nationally that there has either.
What is your gut instinct on that, like, idea? Just curious.
So can I just add, so locally there have been some regions or areas, Sacramento comes to mind. They launched 2 years ago an initiative to get all first graders at benchmark by the end of the year, for the exact reason to sort of say, if we get them then we can keep them on track, and it is easier. And I think I echo Sean's point that even Arizona's legislation was not supposed to be focused on the end of third grade. It was supposed to be focused on the early grades and really getting them on track so that by third grade they were able to pass the assessment. I think our speaker today will speak to some other ways that different states have done, maybe not a sole focus, but a focus on earlier initiatives and earlier strategies. I neglected to sort of highlight, and since we only have this slide, when looking at the data for this, some good news or sort of good news is that some of our subgroups held ground this year. So, which we tend to see when the assessment points, goes down, then we see all groups go down, but our economically disadvantaged stayed the same, as did our Hispanic Latino subgroup stayed the same as last year. So in some ways that's, if there was some positive news in them holding ground. But I do think there is, and part of this group we identified early on, part of the discussion we hope this group would focus on is, how does Arizona focus on those earlier grades in a comprehensive way so that we have a stronger implementation earlier and catch kids quicker? So I think it's a great question, Vice Chair. Yes, Member Palmer.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think kind of to your point of, I can see this as a very big positive, but then I also have a moment of caution, because when you take a look at through the years, even through 2015, the highly proficient and partially proficient is amazingly pretty stagnant throughout the years. But then when you get to proficient and minimally proficient, we see the uptake in COVID, but it really is not that significantly different than before. So it just makes me, it's a huge kudos to the schools of all the work that's been done during COVID. But I also think it's a pause of, why can't we move the needle? Why aren't we able to move the needle in a more significant way in some of those percentages? So that's my observation. It doesn't look as, frankly, I would have expected more dramatic issues coming into COVID.
Thank you, Member Palmer. Member Shepherd.
Yeah, when we look at the data, I do know, as we disaggregate it, we look at the partially proficient. That's such a small range of kids. You're only talking about, 5 questions, maybe separating the minimally proficient from the proficient. And here is this little tiny range of partially proficient. So that range is not going to be huge. Just the number of questions does. How many kids score exactly in this little tiny range? So that's what we do know. And then, of course, your minimally proficient then takes everything below that range and all the way down to 0. So those are some keeps in mind. I did have a question about the data. Is this the general ELA, or is this the reading portion of the ELA only?
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, Member Shepherd. This is the whole ELA assessments. Okay. Yeah. The data are not disaggregated by just the reading portion. They're disaggregated by the whole exam.
Right. Okay.
Yes, Member.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure that we clarified too, this would not count the oral reading fluency part, because that was still part of the field test until this year. Is that correct?
Vice Chair Clark, Member Overton. That is correct. Oral reading fluency was field tested the last 2 years, and the board actually just recently voted to have it become part of the exam moving forward. Though, and not to speak for the department, but we talk to the assessment team at the department pretty frequently, and one of the elements they included in the item that the board voted on was that the oral reading fluency component, while very important, is a rather small part of the test, like the overall score. So it doesn't have a large swing on the scores.
All right. And Member Canto, any questions or thoughts since you've joined us virtually?
No, ma'am. Thank you
Oh.
very much. And I apologize for my tardiness.
Welcome, welcome. All right, well, thank you, everybody. We'll move on to item number 2. I am so excited today because we are going to focus some of our conversation around our policy move on when reading legislation and the cut score for promotion, that retention piece for that 3rd grade. And the goal of today's meeting is for the subcommittee to learn about the cut score and potentially make some recommendations to the board for the conditions that are necessary for a successful examination and possible change in the cut score. To open this section, I have Executive Director Ross presenting on a brief timeline. And as we dive into that, then we've asked and brought in a national speaker who will be joining us today, Kamiana Burke from she is the Senior Policy Fellow in Literacy for Excellence in Education. And Kamiana also played a pivotal role in Mississippi's early literacy movement and will speak to how other states have approached this discussion. So, Executive Director Ross.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the subcommittee. Our staff is just bringing up the timeline slide for you to see in just a moment. What you will see in the slide, there we go. Thanks, Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. What you'll see in the slide is that 2013-14 was the first year of implementation for Move On When Reading. The legislation was passed earlier than that, but there was a sort of a 3-year on-ramp to it. When the cut score for promotion to 3rd grade on the reading portion of the ELA exam was established, it was set to the Ames exam, which was the statewide exam at the time. There was a rather quick change, though, as those of you, myself included, who were in the classroom when this happened. Ames was no longer the statewide exam, and then AZ Merit came in. At the time, the board voted to keep the cut score comparable for AZ Merit to where it had been set for Ames. So they did sort of a crosswalk, and they set the score comparably. And I'll talk a little bit for context about that in a second. The same thing happened when the new assessment AASA came in. The board voted to keep the score comparable to the new exam. So while the statewide assessment has changed twice since the establishment of the cut score, the relative position of the cut score has stayed the same. And then Melissa, can you scroll down a little bit to the text there? So just a couple of key points to consider. The Move On When Reading cut score for 3rd grade promotion is established within the minimally proficient range of scoring. So a student can score in the minimally proficient range and not be a candidate for retention. 3rd grade students who fail to meet or who do not meet the Move On When Reading cut score do have multiple good cause exemptions that will allow promotion to 3rd grade. I'll go over those pretty briefly. It's a student with disabilities on an IEP, and the IEP team agrees that promotion is appropriate. A student, an English language learner who has less than 3 years of English language learning instruction. A student with a diagnosed disability in reading, such as dyslexia. And then there's what's called the one bad day exemption, where if the student did poorly on the statewide exam, but the school has data from valid literacy assessments to show that the student actually has made sufficient progress, the student could be promoted. There is also an option for summer school where the student can demonstrate sufficient progress towards reading and thus be promoted to fourth grade. On average, about 0.03% of third graders are retained after good cause exemptions are applied. So it's a relatively small number of students each year. So any questions? I just wanted to set the context for kind of the history of the cut score, where it's been and sort of how it's been applied. And then just a reminder that the retention component is the last component of Move On When Reading, right? The heart of Move On When Reading is early identification and targeted intervention so that all kids are reading at or above grade level by the end of third grade. And so there are a multitude of practices, strategies, and interventions that happen before a kiddo ever gets to retention. So just to keep that in mind, while it is baked into the name, it is the sort of last part of that legislation. Any questions? All right, then.
No, I thank you. Thank you, Sean, for giving us that context. And now I am going to ask Kamiana to come up. And again, Kamiana, we thank you so much for coming all the way from Mississippi and being here in person with us to share your expertise. And when we wanted to sort of make sure that this subcommittee had the context and the national lens as well as the state lens on this issue, we could think of no one better than you to help us think this through. And so we just appreciate you being here and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Clark. Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, and members of the committee. I am just so happy to be here today. With Excel in Ed, Arizona has always been a great partner with us. I've known Sean a very long time, in Terry, when I was State Literacy Director for the Mississippi Department of Education. So I am just delighted to be asked to be here with you guys today. I'm not sure of the protocol that you all would like to follow, so I can either go through the presentation first and wait for questions at the end, or if you have questions during the presentation, I'm okay with you asking those questions for clarification before I get too far down the road, if that's okay. Okay, next slide. So at Excel in Ed, we believe that policy changes lives. So when we advocate for a comprehensive early literacy policy, just a comprehensive approach to ensure that we're supporting not only our educators, teachers and administrators, right, but also our students and families. We want to ensure that we are addressing learning differences. And one of the best ways to do that is to empower the people, to ensure that we invest in teachers, invest in their knowledge, ensure that they are able to, every day as they stand in front of children, they're able to address those different learning needs. So we believe in ensuring that we're empowering teachers, educators with the knowledge to be responsive to students with reading difficulties, but also stakeholders. Other roles play a very important part in fostering reading success. So for all of our supporters, our parents, community members, community leaders, and policymakers, we want to ensure that they are aware of all of the supports that are needed. It's one thing to write a law, but it's another thing to make sure that all of the things are in place so that implementation can occur and that it can be effective. And then why best practices or interventions are needed. There's a lot of conversation around reading difficulties, but there's also been a lot of conversations about Tier 1 instruction. How do we ensure that the core instruction is as strong as it needs to be, that it can be, so that we can decrease the number of students who need intervention because they're getting a strong core that is also differentiated. Next slide. Policy adoption is the first step. Implementation is key. So these strategies around policy may look very familiar to you because Arizona has adopted all but 2 of these. And the 2 that Arizona has not adopted is summer reading camps and also the elimination of 3 queuing instructional materials. But all of these have been adopted. But I wanted to put this and present this in a way because with retention, as sometimes top of mind for everyone, as was mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that we're focusing on prevention and intervention for students. So all of the components of the comprehensive policy can really fit into one of those buckets. How do we prevent reading difficulty? We ensure that teachers know about the science of reading and can use these things in their classrooms, these strategies. We also want to ensure that we are collaborating with our educator preparation programs. So coursework reflects the alignment of the science of reading. There's an assessment for licensure for our elementary education, and in many cases across the country, special education majors as well. Then also early identification through universal screening, through dyslexia screening and progress monitoring, and then supports for parents and making sure that they're notified early and often. And then the intervention pieces, individual reading plans, summer reading camps, multiple pathways to promotion, and good cause exemptions for students. Next slide. So I want to focus on a few states just to give you a national landscape around the promotion policies. In some cases, opportunities that were made to increase cut scores. And then I'll talk about Arizona last, right? So I'll just give you a national landscape. But first, I want to level set around retention. Now, one of my jobs in Mississippi was to attempt to alleviate a lot of the anxiety around our promotion retention policy. Comms, marketing, all of those things play a really critical role to that. You have to be transparent, even when you don't know all the answers. You have to make sure that you are going directly to those who are impacted. We did a lot of parent meetings across the state to talk to them about the law and what it meant for their children, but also to our educators. We had to make sure that they understood that this is not just a third grade teacher's responsibility. Although these laws are often called read by three laws, a lot of third grade teachers are like, it's all on me, but it's not. We know within the first 30 to 60 days of kindergarten, which students will be at risk for reading difficulty by third grade. So to get to third grade and be so surprised about the number of children who need support, right? We have to make sure that we are looking at our data, utilizing our data, making sure that teachers are aware of how to identify kids early, and then to be able to assist them with remediating those difficulties. And I always try to make sure that I level set with that. The goal is not to retain a lot of students. So that's not why I'm here. That's not why we're having this conversation. It's not, well, let's increase the cut score so we can retain a lot of kids. The goal is to first eliminate social promotion, making sure that we're not passing kids along who are not ready. When implementing retention, ensuring that the retention year is not the same year as the year before. Students have to get something different if you want to have different results. And the overall goal is for our students to be ready, not retained. Next slide. So as of right now, National Landscape, this is also a plug for ExcelinEd's earlyliteracymatters.org site. This site is a one of its kind tool where not only can you identify states' policy adoption, but you can also get a look at their implementation strategies. We've created a rubric for that, whether within each of the fundamental principles that was on the previous slide, all of those that fell under prevention or intervention, you can filter. And then there's a heat map that shows you where this is being implemented across the country and how well, to what degree these policies are being implemented. So currently our site says that there are 18 states that have promotion policies. Oklahoma recently repealed its retention policy this year. So we have 17 states, and those states are included there. With the heat map, of course, those in red are those states that have not adopted this particular component of the policy. Those in orange are states that have future implementation, meaning they've passed a law recently and it will be implemented in 1 to 2 or 3 years from now. And of course, those in green have promotion policies that have full implementation And so I want to make a note there. You may say, whoa, yay, Arizona has full implementation. Yes. But when you dig more deeply in what this policy looks like, right? Or how the implementation is going, then you really kind of peel back some layers, and we'll talk about that today. But as far as what the law says Arizona should be doing with the promotion and retention policy, Arizona has those things on the books. Okay, next slide. So overall, across the country, approaches used to determine grade 3 promotion eligibility vary by state. Most states that have this policy have determined that the third grade summative assessment, the state assessment that students normally take anyway, will be the assessment that's used for the initial determinant of whether students are going to meet the cut score or not meet the cut score. But also for many of those states, they're looking only at the reading portion of the state assessment and not the writing. States that use different initial determinant for promotion. So in Louisiana, they use the literacy screener. That is something that at Excel and Ed, we do not recommend. If you know anything about what a literacy screener is supposed to do, right? It's not meant to be a summative assessment. We have assessments for instruction, and then we have assessments of instruction, which are our summative assessments. So utilizing a literacy screener is not something that we encourage for states to use, but Louisiana has adopted that. And we've had conversations with them. I have to remember we're being streamed live. All right, so for the state assessment plus a literacy screener to make the determinant, Alaska uses that. And in Maryland, if you know anything about what's happening in Maryland now, they have Mississippi's former state superintendent, Dr. Carrie Wright. And she is currently, she has taken a comprehensive literacy policy to the state board. So, which is a very unique way that has not really been done across this country. So most of us will go through our legislature. She's going through the state board to have it adopted in policy. But currently, and they should be voting on that, I think, sometime this month, maybe. Currently, Maryland has a local assessment score that's identified for the state board to determine promotion retention. Good cause exemptions also vary, but most consistently across the country, there are good cause exemptions for English learners, students who were previously retained, and students with a disability in certain circumstances. And some states use a portfolio in addition to multiple opportunities for retests as qualifiers for good cause exemptions. Next slide. So these are some of the approaches and results, and I'll start with Alabama. Some news out of Alabama this morning. Alabama has been having conversations about increasing their cut score that just passed their state board this morning. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And that's why I kind of wanted to start with Alabama first. Alabama passed their third grade law in 2019. So very recent, within the last 5 years. They set the cut score on the test. However, the communications, and I mentioned that earlier, communications, that's extremely important. So they're saying that students who pass the test are on grade level, but they're not on grade level, right? They've simply met the cut score for promotion. So there was a lot of backlash this year. This past spring, that was the first cohort to take the test for promotion retention purposes. The spring 2023 data that you see was really the kind of first year of data for their new assessment. So of course, when you have a new assessment, you want to have that new assessment first and then determine cut scores. And then the following year, it will be the test that goes live. So their TAC, their committee, said that the cut score, in order to show that students are reading on grade level, should have been set at 473. However, the State Board of Education at the time chose to use the cut score of 435, which is 2 standard errors below 473. Although it's considered statistically sound, it's a lower bar. So after 1 year of this assessment going live, which was spring 2024, the state superintendent really kind of led the conversation with the State Board of Education to say, we have to move towards increasing the cut score. That was a low bar. We understand we're easing into the implementation, but we know that we need to move towards a higher cut score. So the superintendent is recommending, and today it passed, moving the cut score from 435 to 444 for the upcoming year. Now that makes it 1.5 standard errors below the 473, but then eventually to 454 by spring 2027, which would still make it one standard error below the cut score, but that was previously suggested, but it would still be an increase in the expectations for students. So what you're looking at is spring 2023, the first year the students took the test but did not count for promotion retention. There were about 68% of the students who were seen as scoring on grade level 473 and above. But there were 17% that were considered sufficient, and they call this kind of the gray area. There were about 15% who were considered in that gray area. 2024, there were 9% of students who were below the cut score, who were considered sufficient for meeting the cut score. And these were the students who were supposedly, are going to be the ones who are retained. So 9% of the students. When they released their article that says 91% of our students are scoring on grade level, there was a lot of backlash from others who were saying, well, it's very misleading to parents, to students, to those who may need additional interventions, but because they're considered passing, they may not receive the interventions that they need. So this is just bigger than retaining kids. This is identifying those students who will need additional support. But if they're not within the cut score, whatever we decide, then those students may be overlooked when it comes to receiving the additional interventions that they need. Next slide. Yes.
Sorry, Kamiana. Chair Clark, that was a lot of information. I don't know if you want to maybe
let's
pause and see if there are
Pause,
questions.
and I think we have some questions, so thank you, Kamiana.
You're welcome.
Member Sanchez.
I have a question about this diagram. So the 68% and the 77% on grade level based off of the cut score, is that including or does that eliminate exemptions, students who would fall in the exemption?
Yes, so those are the students who actually did score the originally intended cut score of 473 or above. They had 68% of students who scored that, but then think about that. That would be 32% of your students who did not meet the cut score and who would need remediation or good cause exemptions or any of those things or be retained, right? So what it shows, I'm glad you asked me that for clarification. What it also shows is over the year, they did have an increase of 9% more students who were meeting that 473 and above. So what they're doing is working, and they're having more students to meet the cut score. But the challenge or the issue was that in addition to the 77%, they also added in the 14%, which are the students who did not meet that 473, to say that we have 91% of our kids who are on grade level. And that's just not an accurate reflection of that. So thank you for that question. Yes.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Chair Clark. Thank you so much for this presentation. As the Alabama superintendent took steps to raise the bar, one, what was the response of the state board and going through that process? And two, what was the response of schools and school leaders, educators, et cetera, because they were making it a little bit more rigorous?
Well, I serve on the Alabama Literacy Task Force. So on that task force, we also have state board members, we have superintendents, we have reading specialists. We had a meeting few weeks ago in Birmingham, and we had this conversation, and the state board members who are a part of the task force are very vocal about it as well. So they were in favor of it. Because when you think about the investment, and I'll talk a bit more if you go to the next slide. If you think about the investment that Alabama has made and is making, right, then the teachers also want to be able to say, we're doing this work. Our kids can meet that goal. We can do this over time. So the reaction from the state board and other leaders was that we're behind you, but we do want there to be steps to the increase. And so that was the compromise, that they would not go directly from their 435 to 454, that they would have the 444 as the first step and then go to 454. But they have not had a conversation about if or when they would get to the 473.
And thank you so much. That's helpful. Did community members and stakeholders, did they ask for additional support or interventions, or perfect?
I'm sorry. You have great questions. And I anticipated your questions, Member Haley. So this is what Alabama has done. We talk about pros and cons when we think about approaches, and I have some other things that I wrote down, but just didn't put on the slides because it was a whole lot of things that they actually have as pros. So I kind of start with the cons first. The first thing that they did when they were told that it was a 473, they reduced it to a lower score needed for promotion. Students, as I mentioned, who still need intervention were also promoted. And the reporting, of course, felt like it was misleading and falsely reported the number of students who still needed support. But the pros, they do have multiple options for promotion. They have thorough intervention strategies. One thing that they just put into their budget is now that they're going to offer interventionists to directly support students in schools. And they have letters, professional development. They have trained over 13,000 teachers to date, and they have 8,000 more teachers who are in progress of letters, professional development. They've also trained EPP faculty, and they now have a required 9 hours of reading courses that they must have in their educator preparation programs. In addition to that, they have very thorough reporting requirements. 757 out of the 764 elementary schools have a local reading specialist, and their goal is to get that to 100%. And that 2024-25 is what I mentioned about the funded. They have asked for funding and received funding to fund interventionists at select schools. So they have a lot of support in a part of it is making sure that those who are on the ground understand that they are not in it alone, right? That we not only want kids reading by the end of third grade, but we're going to help you get there. And this is just a huge show of force of how the Department of Education is going to help them get there. All right, Vice Chair Myers.
Can you talk a little bit more about the local reading specialist and sort of, is that an FTE per school? Just a little bit more about kind of what that role is and what they are able to accomplish in each of those schools.
Yes, well, they're similar to reading coaches, right? They have, yes, and they have the structure similar to what we had in Mississippi, which is the regional specialists that then support their particular cohorts. It's kind of like your coaches have coaches, right? To make sure that they're supported throughout. And they have funding from the State Department of Education, but I'm not sure what % of that funding the state provides, but I can get that information to you. So I'll write that down.
And then I think this is going to be an impossible question for you to answer, but if you were to think about the pros that you have listed there, do you believe that it's like truly this sort of like kind of Swiss cheese like approach of like all of these things are necessary in order to have achieved these gains? Or if you were to pick one of those things that you were going to say, hey, this to me has been the most impactful to achieve these results, which one of those things would you say?
Well, there are two.
Or
Because
two.
there's,
Okay, fine.
like I said, a few things I didn't put up there, which is the professional development that they have going
Okay.
across the state, which is similar to Mississippi.
Mhm.
Invest in teachers' knowledge and provide coaches to help them transfer theory to practice.
Yep. So that would be one, invest in teachers' knowledge, or that's both of
Yeah,
them.
well, they're combo.
Okay, so PD.
PD
Okay.
and coaching.
And coaching. So like,
Because
I'm basically asking you to say that the local reading specialist is one of your beliefs of
Oh,
like
yeah.
the most important
I
thing.
mean, that was one of the biggest
Yeah.
levers we've had, especially in Mississippi, and also what they see now. When coaches attend professional development, and now there's so many different ways where they're sometimes synchronous, sometimes asynchronous, sometimes in person, all of those things. But when they go back to the classroom,
Yeah.
which is also why it's extremely important for our administrators, our educational leaders to be trained as well. When they go back into the classrooms, who's supporting them and holding them accountable, right, for changing their practice, right? You've learned all of these things. How can we ensure that you're going to begin doing these things and changing your practice? And the best way, the most non-threatening way, is through the coaching process. Building that relationship, ensuring that they understand that I'm going to provide feedback. I'll model for you. I'll co-teach. I'll co-plan. I'll do all of these things to get you comfortable with changing your practice in a non-evaluative way. So that combo to me was the biggest lever when it deals with that particular part of supporting educators and it translating into transferring and translating into student achievement and improved student outcomes. But of course, there are all the other things, right? With the assessments, identification, because when we give students screeners and then go into diagnostic assessments and receive the data that says this child is having difficulty in phoneme segmentation, if I don't have the knowledge, I don't even know what to do, right? So when you think about the core, a lot of it is the knowledge of that person standing in front of kids every day.
I just had an opportunity here, sort of the Opportunity Makers report from PNTP, which just came out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And one of the key components of the report is around consistency. And what they found was that actually, like, it does not need to be A+ teaching in every single classroom across the entire state. It just needs to be consistent and quality.
Yep.
And that I think speaks to directly what you're naming here of like the professional development and investing in teachers' content knowledge and the consistency by having a coach that can help hold the line for that bar just really resonates. So thank you very much.
And each class, each year is going to be completely different and they're going to have different needs. So there's not going to be a cookie cutter classroom. And we definitely can't have, teachers with limited knowledge with, that's why we talk about partnering with our EPPs so much, making sure that when their candidates exit their programs, that they're ready on day one. And so I can get on that soapbox, but I won't. But I've talked to a lot of ed prep deans, chairs, and said that, they have to begin to see themselves in K-12 outcomes. We're not silos. What happens there directly impacts how teachers show up on day one. So
so member or facilitator Clark and then member Palmer.
Just a question of clarification around mandatory kindergarten in Alabama. What is or what their school age mandatory age is?
I'm not sure about that. But I also know that they have a very, very strong early childhood program that's been featured nationally.
Yeah.
Their Office of Early Childhood is actually separate from their Department of Education. But they have a very, very strong early childhood component.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Dr. Burke, thank you very, very much. And this is going to be a politics question because I think we have had, we have some coaches within the system. We've been able to get support for that, but we have to fight it every year at the legislature.
Yep.
And part of the issue is, kind of to Member Haley, we don't want to provide, we don't want to increase cut scores without providing the supports. So how do you get around the politics that we have heard of? This is why you get, this is the funding you receive from the state is reading and math, the basics. Why do we need to provide additional resources for coaches? Because we've run into this all the time, every year.
Yeah, well, I know Mississippi has a study on the impact of coaches that I can make sure that I send to you. I was done through Rail Southeast, going into our third and fourth year of implementation. That's also going to be extremely important. Evaluations, external evaluations, monitoring your progress, being able to discuss the return on your investment is going to be key. So partnering for us in Mississippi was partnering with our rail Southeast to make sure that they were able to do that. Also excelling it at the time. So I'll say this. So a very unique approach as well is having those critical conversations with school districts. In some of your school districts, there may already be people with the title or the role of literacy coach, literacy specialist, right? How do you then leverage those who are currently in those positions to begin creating some type of consistency across roles, responsibilities, expectations within your state? Now, for us, our office is a dedicated office to the implementation of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act in Mississippi. That's the goal. All things LBPA fall under that office. We were able to add someone for assessment because we added the kindergarten readiness assessment and also our third grade assessment and our universal screeners. And we felt that that shouldn't be an add-on to our person who's already for assessment for the state. So we created a position for this person to work directly with us with the K-3 efforts. But I think that for the most part, when you think about what school districts are currently investing in, how do you then begin to figure out where the hub is? If anyone has the title of literacy coach, they should be doing these things and should not be serving as an assistant principal or lunchroom duty or those other types of things, right? So first of all, taking stock of what you already have. If funding becomes that type of issue, taking stock of what you have, but then also intentionally saying, even if we're not funding you, if you have this role, then these are the criteria and the roles and responsibilities that you should have in schools. And some states do that through their regional service providers. They look at where coaches may be already in schools, and they have a hub through regional service providers. And then others are going to do it through the state, like Maryland plans to.
Vice Chair Meyerson, and did you have something? No? It looked like you were comes over his Jeopardy button.
I'm just going to use that as an opportunity to shout out Tiana and ADE, because I think that is something that they've been maniacally focused on with the current set of literacy grant dollars and literacy coach dollars, even though it's for far fewer schools than I would imagine they would hope to serve and support. But that has been just, I think, a huge strength so far of the program of like being maniacally focused that like the literacy coach is going to coach. They're not going to do recess duty. They're not going to do these other things. And so just, again, a huge shout out there.
Okay, and to that point, the way that we also wish we could be in Alabama with all of the support, but we started with identifying our lowest performing schools, and we literally had to just place bodies, the number of bodies that we had with the number of schools. Even though we had so many schools that needed support, we only had a certain number of coaches, but very intentionally placing them based on data. Then we started having school districts to say, well, if I hire a coach, will you train them? And we created the modules that we were using for our MDE literacy coaches. Then we began to do regional trainings for those districts that have decided to invest the money in their own coaches. So there are several ways, and I can talk to Tiana offline too, about how to approach building your cadre of coaches, even if you don't have the funding for them. But also when our coaches first started, they didn't want coaches in the schools. They were thinking we were spies, right? You're going to go back and tell what's going on. So you have to let your work speak for you, and the relationships that they build. And then they begin to tell others like, oh my gosh, I have a coach and the coach is doing this for me. So that's going to be helpful as well. Next slide. All right, Mississippi. This screenshot of Mississippi's implementation analysis report also comes from Early Literacy Matters. And when I mentioned earlier that we have reports on each state about their implementation, for Mississippi, we have full implementation of our multiple options for promotion. And this slide just really kind of gets to the specifics around our policy. Earning a MET LBPA requirements level 3 or above on our multiple choice portion of the third grade assessment, achieving a MET LBPA requirements on either of the 2 retest opportunities on our third grade assessment. So our Mississippi reading panel decided that we would give 2 opportunities for promotion. That wasn't necessarily in our law, but it was flexible enough for us to be able to decide that. And then achieving a level 3 or higher on our third grade assessment after the writing is scored. So although our students take the test and then a retest before the end of the school year, during the summer, when their scores come back with the writing portion included, if by chance the writing portion pushes them over to allow them to be at that level 3, then they can qualify for the good cause exemption that includes the retest. And then also for the other retest option, we can include the writing portion as well. So that's when that's included when it comes to the retest opportunities.
Kimiana, my apologies for interrupting. So, Chair Clark, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the subcommittee, just this may not be widely known, but the board voted to update rule on move and win reading a little over a year ago at this point. And one of the elements that was updated in collaboration with the Department of Education was the department has made the third grade AASA exam available again at no charge for schools in the summer, or summer in quotes, when needed, as a retest option for students who did not meet the cut score the first time, who then receive targeted intervention and remediation. That's the important part. And then they can retest at no charge. So I don't know that that's maybe widely known to schools across the state, but that is a relatively recent change.
Thank you. Next slide. So how did Mississippi create the conditions for our increase in cut score? When our law passed in 2013, the promotion retention cut score would be above level 1, which means that students had to score a level 2 or above to be promoted. Our state superintendent, Dr. Wright at the time, led the charge to say we want to get closer to proficiency. We have 5 levels in Mississippi. We have minimal, basic, level 3 is pass, level 4 is proficient, and level 5 is advanced. So she said, well, the next step would be to move to scoring a level 3 or above instead of a level 2 or above. So we passed this amendment, or this amendment was passed in the 2016 school year. So if you think about our runways, we passed our first law in 2013. The first time that the promotion retention component would go live was 2014, 2015. So we had about a 2-year runway to get ready for the test and for the promotion policy to go into effect. Then this amendment passed in 2016 to say in 2018, 2019, so another 2.5 years or so, then this would go into effect. So it helps when you give a runway. It helps when you say, we're going to get ready and we're going to provide these supports, or we're going to strengthen these supports. Because that's one thing about Arizona, you have a lot of things in law already. So a lot of the conversation now needs to be about how do we strengthen the implementation of those things, or begin the implementation of those things, right? So a couple of things that we did for the conditions to get ready for 2018, 2019. With those amendments, we also passed our teacher certification law. Our educators now have to pass the Foundations of Reading assessment to be licensed. And we did not have that before. So this was also the first time that we had some sort of accountability in higher ed. And I'll say this, and I've said it a lot of times. And so when we first started professional development, I reached out to faculty in our higher eds and said, hey, we're offering this professional development. You can actually come to it for free. We're paying for it for our teachers. And out of our 15 public and privates, I had 2 professors to say, okay, send me the stuff. When they got the stuff, right? Because they got all those letters, modules, and all of those things. And it was, oh, I don't have time. So when we passed this law in 2016 around teacher certification, and it went live immediately, so it went live July 1. We got our first batch of data that December. And we had a lot of our students from some of our premier universities who did not pass the assessment. So I, at the Department of Education, started getting calls and emails from parents of college kids saying, we've spent our money, we've spent student loan money, we've done all of these things, and now our child cannot begin their career because they can't be certified for not passing this test. That was a wake-up call for our friends in our educator preparation programs. And we have some great partners with the Barksdale Reading Institute, of course, Angela Rutherford out of Ole Miss, that revived what we called our Higher Education Literacy Council. And everyone came to the table. There were a lot of conversations about how to, if we should change coursework. We already had 6 hours that were required, but found that they were being taught completely differently depending on the campus you visited. And so now through our Department of Education, we have 12 hours of required reading courses across our educator preparation programs. And we've trained, I think we've trained 2 cohorts of faculty now on the science of reading through letters. We also passed an individual reading plan in that amendment. And then also for dyslexia, we have a dyslexia law already. All of our students must be assessed for dyslexia characteristics at the end of kindergarten, beginning of 1st grade. And now there's a requirement that our districts conduct at least 4 hours of awareness training for dyslexia. Next slide.
We just have a question.
Okay.
Member Buttles.
Thank you. With the individual reading plans, can you talk about how teachers are supported in creating those? Is something else taken off of their plate? Is there a template? Can you talk more about that, please?
Yes,
Thank
I'll
you.
be glad to talk about that. Thank you for asking. Okay, so when it passed, there was just like this criteria that our legislature said, okay, these are going to be I think it's 7 components. Part of it, of course, was demographic information, screener information. What type of curriculum are you using? If it doesn't, does it address all components? If it doesn't, what are the supplemental materials that you will use to address that? It also had the, you can see, I created it. So I'm envisioning it right now because I saw the language and I'm like, it has to be in a template. But then it also speaks to interventions. And then after 8 weeks, did those interventions work? If not, why not? What are you changing them to? So it's a great template. Spent a lot of time on it. Team reviewed it, all of that. We put it out to the field. Teacher said, why do we have to do this when we're also completing MTSS packets? Some of the same information we're having to do twice because we're completing it here and we're completing it there. And the one thing that we attempted to create as far as the environment in my department was that we wanted to be usable. It doesn't matter if it's a good idea to me. If I send it out to the field and for those who are using it, it's difficult for them to use it, then right. So another thing that Dr. Wright did was kind of enhance the infrastructure of our department and created an Office of Intervention Services. So I was able to work with the director there, and we included the individual reading plan within the MTSS documentation. And now it only asks them for those specific things about what curriculum you're using, the supplemental materials, and they're already within that packet following the tiers, the interventions and those things. So they were very thankful that it's like now all together and it's not just one. I think it's like maybe Appendix E or something like that now of the MTSS packet. So we were able to merge that. Yep, you're welcome. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I do want to take a moment to talk about the elephant in the room, and that's Mississippi's retention and then the miracle that they say happened in 2019. I love talking about this. So I wrote about this in an article for the Reading League called The Perfect Storm. It was really, Mississippi was last. It had always been last every time, any educational ranking. And we had an education reform-minded governor, Governor Phil Bryant, who's also dyslexic, who said that this was going to be his baby. So What you see in the black are our NAEP scores, kind of beginning for 14, 15, but I'll just level set and say in 2013, our scale score was 209. In the black, you see NAEP scores. As you know, NAEP is administered every 2 years. In the green, you see our third grade assessment retention percentages. And these are the percentages after good cause exemptions were applied. So the retest, good cause exemptions, these are our final retention rates. So what I want to point out is that our first statistically significant gain actually came in 2015, and it was 5 points. So we started out at 209. In 2015, our NAEP score for our fourth grade students was 214. These students had already had 2 years in second grade when they started, they had 2 years of teachers who were learning about the science of reading, screener identification, supports, all of those things. We had not at that time, that was going to be our first cohort of third graders who were retained. So this did not impact any retention or any of the students in that particular NAEP cohort because they were in fourth grade and then we were just beginning to retain third graders. So for our first year, our final retention rate was 8.1%. 2015, 2016, the retention went down to 5.7%, which is something that I do want to stress here. Once you begin doing this work, the goal is for the retention rate to decrease. You're going to have better prepared students. You're going to have better prepared teachers, right? So the goal is for it to decrease. So 2016, 2017, our fourth graders scored 215 on NAEP, which was 1 skill score point. And we would always say, well, at least we're moving in the right direction, right? That year, we had 3.8% of our students to be retained after good cause exemptions for our third graders. The following year, 2017, 2018, would be that third grade cohort that went on to 2019 to score at the national average for the first time in history. That particular cohort for 2017, 2018, we had fewer than 5% of students who were retained. So when those who were writing the article said, well, they scored 219 because they retained so many kids, that was actually the year that we had retained the fewest kids based on our third grade retention law. So I always want to kind of clear that up. So the 9.8% that you see is the first year that we went from level 2 or above to level 3 or above. And so in 2018, 2019, our third grade students, we had 9.6% of our students to be retained based on the LBPA assessment. Next slide. Oh, yes.
Right. I thought that was really interesting. You declined significantly over the course of several years, I guess 4 or 5 years. And then there was a significant jump. What was sort of the cause of that increased jump, sort of that doubling of retention in that 2018-19 school year?
That's when we increased our cut score.
Got it.
From level 2 or above. So it's one of those things where it's like if you raise the bar, they'll meet it, right? So you have to score level 2, which is basic or above, and every year, more and more students were scoring that and above that. And then we raised the cut score. So that 9.6% was the first year that students had to score level 3 or above. And that was 9.6% pre-COVID. Next slide.
Kimyana, just the other thing, I always appreciate how you tell this story and the context and things. But the other thing I wish we could do an overlay is all of when some of those strategies that we've been talking about and the key drivers of were getting to sort of scale and things, and that those were happening, over top of this.
Good point. So when we originally started, the goal was 75 literacy coaches, and they hired 22 coaches plus me and my assistant director at the time, Tanette Smith. By the time we made it to 2018, 2019, I had over 80 coaches in almost half of the elementary schools in the state. So we were able each year to hire coaches and to scale. So that's a very good, y'all asked some really good questions to make me go a bit deeper, and I appreciate that. And we did have more support in our schools, so much so that we had to create an entirely different model for coaching that Alabama has adopted, which is limited support schools, because principals did not want our coaches to leave. Like we had a gradual release model to say, work us out of your school, right? So after a few years, we started having schools that were doing very well on the state assessment. And for a couple of years, they were sustaining. And we said, okay, well, we need to move this coach to somewhere else. And they were like, no, like, don't just snatch the coach. So we created another model to say where we would have limited support schools where they could have the coach quarterly to come and do some professional development or data analysis meetings or whatever they needed them to do before they moved off the list entirely. So we have had schools to move off our list entirely over the years. Okay, next slide. So again, you saw that 9.6%, right, pre-COVID, 2018, 2019. So for 2022, 23, we had 7.2%. So the one thing was there was a lot of conversation around after COVID. Dr. Wright would not be moved. The conversation was, oh my gosh, we need to decrease the cut score. They've had COVID has happened, all of these things. Let's just go back down to a level 2 just because we've had this thing. And she said, nope, not going to do it. We still need to keep the bar high. And as you can see, by 2022, 2023, the retention rate is 7.2% after good cause exemptions have been applied. I wanted to share this screenshot because we have a mandatory reporting requirement with our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, where each year, I think within 30 days of our state certifying our state assessment scores, each school district has to submit their LBPA report, where they have to show by number and percentage the students who were retained in every grade, kindergarten through 8th grade. So that's why you see that. Also, another part of it is by number and percentage of each student that was promoted for good cause by category of good cause. So we can see like how many students were retained based on the retest. I mean, were promoted based on the retest or anything else. But it also shows the initial pass rate of MAP and then the initial and the retest pass rates. So this is a part of, if you look at our website, you'll see reports from 100 and so districts, and they also have to put it within like a local newspaper, the link to this report. And they have to identify, they have to have a link to their promotion retention policy. Because when we first started, there were some school districts that put into place 1st grade retention or 2nd grade retention. And I had parents asking, like, is it just 3rd grade? Is there a policy for 2nd grade? Is there a policy? It's like, no, for the state, it's just 3rd grade. School districts will have their own promotion retention policies, whether it's because a student's been absent or didn't score a certain thing. So we had to make sure that parents were aware, because some parents are saying, well, I wasn't even aware that we had that. So a part of the reporting is that there is a link to that district's promotion retention policy as well. Next slide. And lastly, for Mississippi, we did, when I got to Excel and Ed, I remember just there were so many reporters that said, okay, well, what happened to the kids? Like, y'all retained some kids. What happened? How do you know that the retention has worked? So one of the things that I was allowed to do was to commission the Wheelock Center at Boston University. And because this is so important to the field for all of the states that are adopting promotion retention policies, and Excel and Ed really kind of wanted to be at the forefront of saying, okay, this has been this Mississippi story, what has happened to those students? So if you know anything about the cut scores and how this type of study is done, they've done it for several states, Marcus Winters and team, is that they look at the students who scored just above the cut score and were promoted, and those students who scored just below the cut score and were retained. there could probably be a difference of 2 or 3 questions that the other student answered correctly, but they were promoted instead. Now, they followed the first cohort through 6th grade for those who were retained and through 7th grade for those who were promoted, but they looked at that 6th grade assessment for both cohorts. By 6th grade, students who were retained had substantial and sustained literacy gains on their ELA scores compared to their peers who were promoted to 4th grade. Those gains were especially significant among African American and Hispanic students. In the cohort, results indicate the law had no significant impact on student absences or special education identification in the 6th grade. So the challenge is always thinking about how is this going to impact the student once they're retained. Will they want to come to school? How will they feel? Will teachers feel like this is the road to special education, right? You have to make sure that that's not the conversation, that it's not the road to special education. And then students who were retained did not appear to experience other negative consequences as a result of their retention. The one thing that was unique about this study is that it did not show any type of impact on math, whether it was positive or negative. Normally, from what we were told, there's usually also an increase in math. We saw that on our state scores in some grades, but for this particular study in these groups of students, we did not see it there, but it wasn't negative or positive impact. Okay, next slide. So for Florida, when the CARES Act came about, 2020, 2021, for COVID, Florida had about 18 state regional literacy directors. They wanted to, if you know anything about Florida, they passed their law 2002. So they were one of the first states to do this, right, under former Governor Jeb Bush. And they are always looking for ways to make sure that they improve. They recently banned 3Qing, so they are continuing to improve their supports. They had training and support they adopted new standards called the BEST standards, and then, of course, targeted tiers of supports. A question I think, Vice Chair Myerson, you asked about nationally what's being done in other grades. So Florida actually has this guidance around putting your highest performing teachers in 1st and 2nd grade. So they wanted to really target those areas. So I wanted to make sure I circle back with you on that. So after that, in 2021, 2022, they adopted this initiative called RAISE. Their regional structure for their regional literacy directors doubled in size. They had over 1,000 schools identified for support. The other things are there. They provide schools with school improvement plans, support, data-informed instruction, high-quality instructional materials, and universal targeted and intensive tiers of support will continue for that. Some additional things about RAISE are on the next slide. Universally, these are some of the supports that all schools get. There are some schools that get targeted support, and there are other schools that receive intensive support. So this is just another approach to the supports that you're providing, especially when you're lacking the funding, right, needed to go for a full out implementation, making sure that you are identifying tiers of supports for particular schools. Next slide.
We have one question from Member Palmer.
Sorry, Madam Chair, Dr. Burke. So one of the coolest things I think that Florida did was that they actually, in one fell swoop, paid for new instructional materials in all schools. Have we seen the results of that and what that looks like? Because we had a previous committee meeting where we showed that it's kind of across the board in Arizona as far as the level of quality materials.
Yeah, I have not seen data
Okay.
about that. I'll ask Carrie Miller.
Okay. Yeah. It's
Write
just,
that down, Sue.
it's great. It was like almost $200 million of just, we're going to start from ground zero and have everyone have quality instructional materials.
It's a great, and we are, Carrie Miller is part of our learning exchange with Florida. And next month when we have that meeting, we can make sure to also circle back.
Yeah. I'm getting some assignments from this group, Sean. Okay, next slide. Okay, so also the other unique thing about Florida is they have not increased their level for pass rates. They've increased the rigor of their assessments. Okay, so as you see across, what this graph shows you is that in orange, this is the percentage of students who are scoring in level 1. their students had to score above, they have to score above level 1. So you see the percentage of students scoring in level 1, but also the gray shows the percent of those students who were actually retained within that level, right? The others may have been promoted for good cause exemptions or and Florida has the portfolio that they've had since the beginning. So they have multiple options for promotion. So they had the FCAT from 2001 and 2002 after they had it. And then of course they began this initiative. 2010, 2011, they changed to the FCAT 2.0. 14, 15, they briefly had the FSA, and now they have what's called the FAST assessment that they implemented. As you can see, there have been moments where the retention rates were increased, and then after implementation of the new assessment over time, and the bar being raised, teachers understanding what the bar is, how to meet the bar, right? Students being prepared for the new bar as far as the assessment is concerned. And then, so this is just a great example of how you can see the expectations on the assessments that were made more rigorous, and then also how it impacted the retention rates in Florida. Okay, next slide. So this was something that was unique about Florida's data. So for students who scored level 1 on grade 3, this is how they performed in grade 4, okay? So on the left side, those students who scored level 1 on grade 3 in 2016, 2017, and were retained actually scored, 16% of those students scored level 3 or above in grade 4. They were retained. Those students who scored level 1 on grade 3 and were promoted, only 6.4% of those students scored level 3 or above. And on the right side, same thing, scored level 1 on grade 3 who were retained. Over 50% of those students were able to score level 2 or above in 4th grade on the state assessment. And for those who were promoted, only 30% scored level 2 or above. So I thought that's very unique data, especially with the year and the couple of years following the promotion retention right after, to be able to see those gains almost immediately. And we'll continue to reiterate that the 3rd grade year has to be something different. Next slide. All right, Nevada's grade 3 promotion policy. Nevada now has future implementation. They adopted promotion retention in 2015, repealed it in 2019, and reinstated it again just recently in 2023 with an implementation year of 2028, 2029. Seemingly, they are wanting to start with this cohort, right, of kindergarten students to ensure that by the time they reach 3rd grade, that they will have had the benefits and the impact of all of the supports to ensure that they're ready. That runway is kind of long. And that's all I'll say about that. Next. Arizona. All right, Arizona. I'm about to talk a little bit about data. And I always say to states when I talk about data, this is a safe space. It has to be, right? Because we have to know where we are in order to know where we need to be and how we can get there. So this is a Q&A from the FAQs for Move On When Reading. What is the cut score? You can view the cut score here. The cut scores only apply to the reading portions of the exam and are not equivalent to the minimally proficient range. A student may be minimally proficient and still meet the cut score. Okay? So as transparent as you can be, but also knowing that a student can be minimally proficient and still meet the cut score. So how does this impact 4th grade teachers? I don't know if I mentioned this about Alabama, but their superintendent is going to begin a Beyond Grade 3 initiative to ensure that teachers and students in 4th grade and beyond have support. So understand, for 4th grade teachers, hearing from 4th grade teachers who say, well, we get these kids that have passed this test and they still need a lot of help. And then when you think about a 4th grade teacher or 4th and 5th grade teachers who may have in their schools different configurations, like students may begin to go to a specific class for science or a specific class, they may be departmentalized for math. When do they have the time to provide those intensive interventions, or do they know how? were they trained to teach children how to read, right? So you have to think about this impact is not just, oh, wow, we can show this percentage of our kids who've passed, but what happens next? And how do they continue to be supported? Next slide. So this was from the Manhattan Institute, and this was kind of a study that was done also by Marcus Winters and another one of his colleagues that included Arizona, test-based promotion of student performance in Florida and Arizona. And the one thing that was noted that I thought was extremely important was it says that Move On in Reading, of course, was modeled in part after Florida, which most of the states have been. Potentially important difference is that Arizona's policy set the performance standard that students were required to reach on the state's reading test at a much lower level than did Florida's policy. Approximately 3%, and this was from 2013, 2014, approximately 3% of Arizona's third grade students scored in the falls far below category in the policy's first year, and thus were targeted for retention. And after that, less than 1% of third grade students were retained under the policy. Does that sound familiar? Because that's also where we are in 2023, 24. Okay, next slide. And this is just a graphic representation of that 0.3% students retained due to Move On when reading. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk just a few slides about the scale scores and in comparison with Florida, who's had the longest, 2002, and then also Mississippi since 2013. So a little bit later than Arizona adopted its policy, but right at the implementation point of it. Arizona's in orange. So for all students, Arizona has, especially since 2013, there was an increase and has really kind of remained steady. But if you look at Mississippi, Mississippi has grown during that time, right? And then, of course, post-COVID, there was a dip. Just want to note this trend line for all of our states, actually. How did we, from 1992 until 2022, how have we performed over the last 30 years? There could be some instances where you can look at like maybe 2009, where you all were at a score of 210 and said, oh, I know what happened during that time, right? Or I know why our scores were low. But then also you can begin to think about 2013, 2015 to say we had started to implement the Move On when reading. There was more of a focus, and what gets measured gets done in a lot of cases, right? Okay, so this is where you are. Next slide. Let's look under the hood a little bit. And let's first look at our free and reduced lunch students here in Arizona. Arizona's free and reduced lunch students are scoring now, well, 2022, around the same that they were in 2013. So almost 10 years ago, at the same skill score of 2001. If you've noticed, Mississippi's free and reduced lunch students are now at the score of 212. I think our free and reduced lunch students are second in the nation, I believe, for that group of students. And of course, Florida had some increases, and they have dipped a bit for free and reduced lunch students from 2019 to 2022. Yes. $10 points equals 1 grade level on NAEP. So if they've scored, oh yeah, that means that it's a grade level behind, or yes. So 10 points for NAEP skill scores equals 1 grade level. Okay, next slide. All right, and for your Hispanic students. Mississippi, only beginning around 2009, had a population that was large enough to be represented on NAEP. So looking under the hood for Arizona's Hispanic population, of course, there has kind of been some consistency of around 203 and now 205 for the last 11 years. And as you can see, Mississippi has had some gains and then drops significantly post-COVID. But I just wanted to make sure that we were not just looking at overall students, but also really paying attention to some of these subgroups to ensure that they're getting what they need as well. Okay, next slide. So I'm almost done. I always like to talk about this collective impact approach, because now it's what do we do about it? Not just what does this subcommittee do, right? Not just what the DOE does, but what do we do about it? If there are stakeholders, if there are other coalitions, other groups, other partners, you have to make sure that everyone has the same goal. We may be getting to it in a different way, but we all want to ensure that what we do complements the other and that we all have the same goal. Overall goal, of course, is ensuring that more children are reading on grade level or meeting the cut score for being promoted to 4th grade. But how are we getting there? Are our efforts being multiplied, right? Or are they being just kind of divided with different options or approaches or avenues that may not end up at the same place? Next slide. And so Arizona, as I mentioned before, when you think about policy adoption, Arizona has adopted 16 out of 18 of the policy components that we consider are necessary for a comprehensive approach for teachers and administrators, educated prep, students, parents, and families, except for the eliminating 3 queuing for the instructional materials and summer reading camps. So I believe that the goal for Arizona, and I see that there is a future implementation of your science of reading training, which is one of the critical components about building knowledge, which also may be a part of why you've been kind of stagnant, right? You've made some growth in some areas as far as moving around, especially in the national rankings, but how much more growth could have been accomplished to this point, right? So now we have to really look at implementation. Most critically, how do we increase the knowledge of our teachers? And I know that you have a K-5 endorsement, you know, and other things that you're also putting in place that will help that. So as a group, consider the implementation and how consistently these things are being implemented across districts. We have local control in Mississippi. Most states have it, but how can it be messaged that these are the best practices, the expectations, these are the things that should be consistent across the state so that as a state, we can move. It's also great to have those school districts that are doing all of these things that you can lift up and lift out. In Mississippi, we created what's called Science of Reading Schools. We pay for a banner. The literacy team goes to the schools. So the Science of Reading schools, they have at least 80% of their teachers who have gone through Science of Reading training. And they get to hang a banner outside of their school that says, we're a Mississippi Department of Education Science of Reading school. They also just did that for Jackson State, was the first university to receive a Science of Reading badge to say that our elementary education reading department has been recognized for Science of Reading by the Mississippi Department of Education. Those types of things that are minimal costs, but that shows that I see you, right? And that also others strive to be. I remember Kristen, who was the literacy director after I left, saying that there was a school that was like, we missed the deadline. Like, we want to get our banner and we've had our teachers. I mean, so it creates this sense of pride. So there has to be more things than these are the rules and regulations, or this is the guidance. These are the things you have to create this sense of, for real, we're in this together. For 2018, 2019, what I also didn't mention was we did a social media campaign. So the one thing that I loved about my CEO at the time, Dr. Ben, we called her the idea fairy. And so if I would go to her with an idea, she'd be like, okay. And so I was like, why don't we do a social media challenge? And we called it Next Level Up. So the entire year that we were leading into going to level 3 or above, we had different schools to post on social media. They had to do a short video of how they were leveling up in their schools. Brett Favre was on one. Our Congressman Benny Thompson joined in on one for his district, our Miss Mississippi. So schools actually called like celebrities and was like, we're doing this video. But you could see in classrooms where they were like dissecting things. The children had on like like the little medical gloves where they were dissecting sentence. I mean, it was just amazing. And at the end, each principal say, well, now I challenge this particular school. Like, you have so many days to post your video. We showed them at the state board. We picked a few, had those principals to come to the state board meeting. I mean, so all of those things together. So guess what? Even if you didn't see it in a card that was put in the book bag or a letter that was emailed, it was all thousands and thousands and thousands of views. It was all over social media. So we had to reach people where they were when we wanted to make sure that they knew that a cut score change was coming. So I think that ends it for me. Thank you. If there are any additional questions, Chair Clark, I will take them at this time.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really excellent. And of course, while you were doing the initial things, I was looking up NAEP scores, just to let you know, because I'm thinking, because my question I was thinking about, have you looked at the complexity of these different state tests?
I have not. That would be Christy Hovanetz from Excel and Ed. I'm not the math person. I'm not.
Well, and that's fine. And so as I was thinking about that, I thought, oh, I wonder how the different tests are, what's their philosophy of testing? And I thought, well, it should show up then in NAEP scores in fourth grade. And so that's why I was looking up and then I didn't realize it was later on in the presentation. So thank you so much for that thoroughness, and especially following the cohorts. That's really important to find out. Yeah, they do have a successful fourth, and so I'd love to know what their fifth and their sixth and their seventh. Right. What happens in those years as well.
Yeah. But Christy Hovanetz is our accountability. I think she's on your tag here. And so she's on the tags for several states across the country. So she'd be better to answer the question about the rigor and all of the other tests. But also one of the things that Mississippi did as well was we also adopted a more rigorous test that was more aligned to NAEP. Our state superintendent would always say that we were the poster child for the honesty gap because our state test was saying that we had, let's just say 40% of kids in proficient, and NAEP was like, no, you do not, right? There may be 13%. So we had to make sure that we begin aligning those expectations that we have for the national assessment to also how we were assessing our kids so that we could have the right data. But thank you so much.
Thank you again for the presentation. It was wonderful. One of the things as our district has kind of really embraced all things science of reading over the last few years, I think one of the statistics that has most stood out to me is that basically like 95% of kids should be able to read fluently. It's really only like 5% who might have any sort of additional accommodation need or dyslexia or something in that kind of last 5%. Like 95% of kids should be fluent readers. Which feels like a lot of percent, and a far gap, obviously, from where we are. I'm curious, as you think about all of these sort of additional programs that you all have put in, whether it's literacy coaches, et cetera, I still sort of am of this belief that like if we don't have a foundational set of curriculum at schools that is science of reading aligned, and just, I saw that we got like a star there, but I'm just sort of curious. I think we still have a little ways to go just of even just being able to say, is this a quality curriculum that is science of reading aligned? And I'm wondering, as individual states adopt their own kind of view on what that quality is, how that aligns with either getting a star on that little map or what additional sort of support you're seeing states take to ensure that it is truly quality. Because you could have a great literacy coach and all of these wonderful things, but if your kids are just basal readers or, whatever, not going to get them there.
So a couple of things. This is why we also added the ban on 3Qing, because correct. So high quality instruction materials at some point became synonymous with curriculum aligned to the science of reading. So what we noticed in policy, even at Excel and Ed, as we continue to, review and update, is that in our HQIM component, we're really saying what should be in curricula. We were not saying what should not be, right? And so that's why that ban complements the fact that, okay, you've adopted, or this vendor has said that our curriculum is aligned with the science of reading. Oh, but in addition to that, you can do some of these 3 queuing strategies, right? So making sure that there is, for a lot of states now, that's why they have those committees, right? Task forces or panels that are reviewing curricula to ensure that they also do not have those 3 queuing instructional materials. Also, the Reading League has released their curriculum navigation reports that detail which curricula have 3 queuing in them, which is fantastic because now, you know, boards or committees can go to that and they can see firsthand. So that's one thing. The second thing is in Mississippi, our kind of knowledge and expectations of HQIM came later. Louisiana was next door doing all things HQIM. We visited them and everything, but we still weren't doing it. It was honestly our teachers, after being trained, to say, well, I'm going back to my classroom and the curriculum that we have is not aligning with this new knowledge that I have. So there was really kind of this groundswell from educators to say, oh, our curriculum isn't aligned, which informed a lot of the changes that some of our districts made. Again, we're local control too. We don't pay for curricula, right? We give very strong guidance. We have HQIM pilots going on where we're, you know, helping them to get those materials and implement those things. But it's really more along the lines of when our educators become more knowledgeable about the expectation, they become more and more frustrated with what's been put before them for them to be able to teach. And that has done a lot for us in changing curriculum on those local levels. Yeah.
Just another question. Similarly aligned with Member Meyerson's question, what role in preparing school leaders helped to achieve some of the results that Mississippi has seen and or even Florida?
So initially, we adopted letters of professional development for teachers, and then there was a principal's primer for administrators. The principal's primer was more of how to be a literacy leader. There's a checklist for MTSS or, you know, your scheduling or those kind of administrative things. And we started getting feedback from administrators that said, hey, but I still don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for when I go into the classroom. Our coaches started giving us more feedback on, well, not only am I coaching teachers, but I noticed that I'm also having to coach the administrators in the building on what to look for. And so that's when we actually scrapped that. I hear now that letters does have another component for leaders that is better. So we scrapped that and we sent our administrators through letters the same way that we sent our teachers through letters so that they could get the knowledge that they needed. But we also partnered with our school improvement team, because here was the thing, especially when a school's not doing well, they get a lot of support. One thing that we noticed, the coach would come back and say, hey, I saw somebody else in the school with an MDE badge. Like, what are they doing? You know, and then we noticed that some of our school improvement coaches, they work with principals, and our coaches were working with teachers, and they were not saying the same thing because my office had not met with their office. It really does seem like we came together and sang Kumbaya and everything just magically happened. It did not. Like, we had to really build this plane. And so once coaches started saying, well, I see other people like with the badge, and we had to begin to have meetings. Okay, who's in these schools? These are the schools we're in. Who else is in these schools? For the directors, executive directors in the department to say, well, let's come together and let's figure out what kind of guidance we're going to give to our people so that they are in alignment. And then we told principals, first of all, it's your building. You have to be the one to facilitate what happens in your building. These are your goals that you come up with. So even if there are consultants, because we had a lot of consultants in buildings, and sometimes we found out that they were just teaching. They weren't coaching, right? A teacher would be sitting in the back of the room and a consultant comes in and he's like, I'm gonna teach your ELA class, because they want their data to show that they're neither here nor there. Y'all know. So we really wanted to focus on building the capacity of the teacher. So we had, for the first time, when I was there, we had a meeting with a lot of the consultants that were going in and out of districts to be like, you've been here for 10 years and the scores haven't changed. Like, why are you still getting a contract? worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So let's start having some real conversations about the supports that we're having. We had to have a lot of critical conversations in Mississippi. I just think that the timing and the climate was right. Like, we're moving in this direction. Either you move with us, right, or not. But I think that has to be a part of it. Who's in schools? Who's messaging whatever needs to be messaged? That's a part of that collective impact piece. And for school leaders, knowing what should be happening in schools. And you don't have to just be an evaluator as an administrator. You can coach too. Because before this coaching thing became real, like, I remember getting like an evaluation from my principal and was like, hey, you're doing these things great, these few things you need to change, and I'll see you next spring. And if I could change those things, I would have been doing them already. So, like, who's going to coach me on how to get better? So when you come back next spring, so coaches can also be, administrators can also coach as well, but it's also about building their knowledge.
Did you mention that Mississippi Department of Ed has their own office for the Literacy-Based Promotion Act?
Oh, yeah.
And about how many people are in that team, on that team?
Okay, so we have what's called an educator in residence model. There is one position. The state literacy director is the position that has the pen for the state agency. So we could not go to the legislature and say we need to hire 75 people to work for the state. So with our educator in residence model, we actually partner with school districts where the Department of Education, we've done the interviews, we've identified the people, but the district superintendent has to agree to be a partner with us and allow this person to leave. It's kind of like a deployment where it's like, if Terry is a first grade teacher and she hears that Mississippi is looking for literacy coaches and she says, I want to be a coach. We say, we'd love to have you. We would have to say to that district, well, Terry's going to be on loan to us. We will pay her salary, and we're going to give you, by us paying for her salary, it frees up the salary for your school district to be able to hire someone in her position. So after 3 years, Terry says, hey, don't want to do this anymore. I want to go back to my district. They have to agree that as long as we notify them by March 1, that they will have a position for her. So maybe she's not the first grade teacher anymore, maybe she's second grade, but that also allows for our coaches to have a sense of stability because we're funded annually by our state legislature, right? We get those $15 million a year for appropriations. So they don't want to say, well, I'm waiting every year to see if I'm going to have a job. This helps them to have a sense of security, to know that they are still employed through their district. However, the district understands in the MOU that we evaluate coaches, we assign coaches. Just because she comes from your district, if your district's not on the list for support, she can help you with some things, right? She can do a PD or two, but she's going to be assigned where we need her to be as far as our list is concerned. So that's called an educator in residence model. So we have some who've been in residence since we started 11 years ago. The superintendents have changed the whole nine and they're still with us, but nobody's been pressing us on it. But yeah, so that's how we are able to hire and allow them to represent and work with the Mississippi Department of Education and not be actual Department of Education employees.
Amazing presenter. Any other questions? Member Canto on virtual? Any questions? No?
No, thank you. I've been taking notes, but been very clear. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank
Member
you.
Overton.
So I did just want to make a clarification. When we're comparing the states, the students who do not move on when reading, I know that's not what the other states call it, it's because they did not meet a cut score. Compared to, we still have those minimally proficient students who have not met the cut score or they haven't met the cut score, but they're still minimally proficient. If you consider them minimally proficient at another state, they do not move on when reading. Is that correct?
Okay, so you still have a cut score, but yours is just within your lowest level. So it's still, it's considered the lowest cut score in the country.
Okay.
In Arizona. So you still have a cut score, but within your level 1, we'll say bar, There are some students, because they may be a little bit above that, they will be promoted because your cut score is really low. In others, I mean, but you also have good cause exemptions. Other states have that as well. So if a student doesn't meet a cut score in Mississippi or in wherever, then they will have additional opportunities. As Sean mentioned, now you all have an opportunity for a retest. They may have additional opportunities through retest or through good cause exemptions, but they can be promoted in that way. What's critical as well is when they are promoted to fourth grade. For us, our students still have to have an individual reading plan. They're promoted for fourth grade for good cause, but in law, you have to have an individual reading plan. They have to have the 90 minutes uninterrupted of science and reading instruction. So we have all of these things in law to support students in fourth grade. In Tennessee, students have access to tutoring. They partner with Tennessee, I think it's Tutoring All Core, for their students to receive tutoring throughout the year. So as long as you have different supports for those students and they're not forgotten, because you can't just say, wow, they were promoted. No, they're promoted, but it's for a good cause. And we need to know that these students aren't just showing up because they've met everything. They actually had some additional support in order to be promoted. So the same with Arizona, there's a cut score, good cause exemptions that may allow them to be promoted. If not, then those students are retained. But again, that's a very, very few students.
Okay, thank you. The
You're
reason I asked that question, and I can just speak for my district, is I just feel like we look at all those good cause exemptions and we take a deep breath if they meet one of those, or if they do go to that summer school program and they show the growth, then, you know, we do everything we can to promote the student. But then, like you're saying, once we've promoted them, I don't know that there's the follow-up that needs to happen. So if we want to do everything we can to promote them, then what do we do to then support them and the teachers when they do go to fourth grade? Or do we stop trying to do everything we can and, you know, find every good cause exemption there is to then just move them on? I think I think it just really should be on our minds as we're making these decisions. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the subcommittee. I had referenced earlier that the board had adopted some updated rules for Move On When Reading about a year ago. Amongst those updated rules were a requirement that students who are promoted from third grade because of a good cause exemption receive specific strategies in fourth grade, diagnostic assessments to determine their level of, or their area of struggle, targeted intervention, placement with a highly rated teacher. There's a sort of a list of them in rule. Now, unfortunately, that's not funded. Move On When Reading is a K-3 legislation, but it is in rule that those supports are in place for students who are promoted to fourth grade because of a good cause exemption.
And I'll say this because of our coaches. It's great to have these things in policy, but where's the monitoring of that? So because we had coaches in schools, especially our lowest performing schools, our coaches really kind of served a few different purposes. They could say, I'm going to help you with these individual reading plans. Like, let's talk through what needs to go in them. How are we going to monitor this? They could also say, this is the window for screening. Have you started screening your, like literally those types of things to say, I'm monitoring to make sure that you are doing these things. So in again, a non-threatening, non-evaluative way, but we had someone boots on the ground in schools to say, these are the things that you're supposed to be doing. And I'm going to make sure that you're doing those things. When you don't have that, or when it's, the principal responsible for all of that, everything else, in addition to being an administrator and all of that, it really does go back to what gets measured gets done. And where is this on your checklist of things around implementation that you are monitoring and measuring? So even if, I know you said it's not funded, but even if it's not funded, for our K-3 literacy effort, our coaches would say, well, we're doing professional development for K-3 teachers, and the principals invited their fourth and fifth grade teachers too. Was that okay? And I'm like, yeah, that's okay, right? So how do we take advantage of some of the opportunities that we already have to make it a school-wide effort and buy-in? like from everyone, because it benefits the fourth grade teacher if kids are ready. Like it benefits them, right? It also benefits them to learn a little bit more about the science of reading, because if they don't understand your scientific terms, it might not be because they just hate science. They might not be able to read your content or access your content, which is causing them to not do well in your classroom. So I think there are just kind of a multitude of ways that we can begin to monitor the implementation of some of those things to just make sure that they're happening and consistently across schools.
One last question. Just to bring it back to this report because I just heard this whole like 2-hour session on this opportunity makers report yesterday. But one of the things that I heard kind of loud and clear from the report that studied these gap closing, trajectory changing schools was that they actually found very few school systems that were gap closing or trajectory changing. They found gap closing schools. And so I'm curious, in Mississippi, as you think about any sort of outlier results, did you find that to be isolated to the school and like this incredible principal who was just, eating up all of the things? Or were there any examples of system-wide success that you could point to and if so, what contributed to that level of change and that level of growth for kids?
Yeah, there were a lot of individual school success. And I'll say this is why we put coaches in schools that we didn't look at district grades. We looked at individual school grades. So we could have a high performing district, a district that's like a B, but out of 7 schools, there are 2 that are kind of in the rural area. They're scoring Ds like they, but overall the district looks great. So we focused a lot on making sure that within those schools, we were building leader capacity. We were building teacher capacity and those things. In some of the system-wide things, especially in the Delta, the poorest area in the state, poorest area in the country, honestly, we saw some system-wide changes from some conservators. So those who had actually been placed in the district because historically they were just underperforming. And I think that there was another level of accountability for those types of district leaders to grow, right, the district and grow the schools. So also, Dr. Wright had a teacher she had a teacher's council. She met with teachers across the state. She had a principal's council, a superintendent's council. So there was always this communication with her, not just with the different departments. Before we were going to release something, like she would have gotten feedback from principals, teachers, superintendents, and she's doing the same thing now in Maryland. I keep seeing on LinkedIn, like, if you want to be a part of the teachers council, if you want to be a part of the, so again, it's going to be about this buy-in. That's important. And we also celebrate, but we're very transparent about data. So in our state board meetings, when data comes out, it's on the screen for everyone to see. We compared the 3rd grade score pass rates. We would have the top 10 and the bottom 10 schools and districts. When we looked at our kindergarten readiness assessment, we compared our students in our early learning collaboratives to public school pre-K, to Head Start, to kids coming from home. And then at the end of the year, we would do our post report, like this is the growth that they've made. You celebrate. But when I say it was data transparency, but also every month, almost every month, there was something brought before the board about literacy in the superintendent's report. I would sit down with comms and we would have a calendar. Oh, in September, we're going to do a spotlight on literacy through this. Oh, in November, we're going to visit a school and we'll have a video and we'll do this. It was always at the top of mind for everyone because literacy is like closing the gaps. That was like number 1 on our state board goal.
No, that's great. And I mean, would it be safe to say that like you thought of this as like a school-wide reform effort versus like a district-wide reform? So like you're really going after each individual school versus kind of starting at the district and then having that flow down?
So I'll say we went at it from both ends. This was our very first state-led initiative for literacy. We always had pilots. Listen, when you're a poor state, everybody wants to come and get data from your kids, from your Black kids, from your poor kids, okay. So we were always having people who wanted to come and fund things for a couple of years to try out what they're doing, to get the data but once they would leave, it wasn't sustainable. So this was the first time that this was a state-led approach, and we put coaches in schools. So we were doing it from the school level and also from the state level. And just in so many cases, I mean, your school leaders are just hungry for information, your district leaders, and then it's a competition. It's like, how do we move our district? Right now that I have more knowledge, I know better
Right.
what to do. So I think that's why I kind of call it the perfect
Yeah.
storm. It was just, there was this momentum, and we kind of call it Mississippi momentum. They now say it's Mississippi marathon, right? Because it doesn't end. We still know that we have a lot of students that we still need to support and to become proficient readers. It's never ending, but we know that we've been seeing some progress with the things that we've been doing. And so we just try to keep the momentum from that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Again, thank you. I think this was so exactly what we were hoping for. And we appreciate
Thank you.
you have been sort of a mentor and an angel to Arizona for many, many years. And we just continue to appreciate you sharing your guidance, your expertise, your knowledge, and the transparency of, she'll call me on things when Arizona's not doing what we should be doing. And that's the last person I want to get on the wrong side of. So, but just thank you. So we're going to move into
you.
the subcommittee discussion. Yeah, another round of applause.
Yeah.
And I know Kamala has to at some point move to catch her flight, but we're hoping we just, maybe you can stay for a little bit of the discussion in case we have questions. But yes.
Chair
Executive
Clark,
Director
might I
Rice.
recommend a 5-minute bio break for
Come
everyone?
on. I thought I'd shorten the discussion by making no bio break, but yes, we'll do a 5-minute break. You guys can do the bio break, or again, take advantage of the 5 minutes, and we'll be back at 11:05. All right, that was more than a 5-minute
Thank you. We needed it.
break, but I hope everybody let's come back for church. We are back in session. And member Canto is there? Yes, yay. All right. So we will now move to the subcommittee discussion related to the conditions and environment necessary for an effective examination and potential change to the Move On When Reading Cut score. Again, just a reminder, the goal of this section is to ask questions, discuss ideas. I'm going to actually say we're going to also, what happens with this group is they tend to make recommendations or suggest things, and we're just going to do it all at the same time. Because Sean is amazing at note taking and captured our spontaneous problem solving so amazingly. So item 3 and item 4 will sort of merge into one. And we encourage a robust discussion, more questions. I know Kiana will have to leave, but she is here for a little bit. So please, who would like to begin? This is where no one makes eye contact with me. Oh, yes, sorry.
So Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the subcommittee, just maybe to help spur things, as a reminder, typically recommendations take 3 forms, either recommendations for some sort of guidance, typically from ADE, though it could be from the board, suggestions for potential changes to board rule to Arizona Administrative Code, or suggested changes that we would take down to the ledge in this session. So suggested changes to legislation. This particular topic is interesting. It's a bit different than other topics you all have addressed. So you can go out of those confines. So just as an example, and I'm not trying to steer anything, just as an example, it doesn't, if you all wanted to make sort of a blanket idea and then recommendations underneath it, like a framework or something like that, that's fine as well. It doesn't have to just be like kind of one-off recommendations. It can be more holistic. Whatever form you all want it to take, board staff will capture it, and then we will vet it through leadership of the committee, and then we send it out to you guys to look at, just as we did with the last set of recommendations.
Thank you, Executive Director Ross. Vice Chair Meyerson.
Thank you, Executive Director. I was actually going to say something just sort of slightly similar. So we've been reading 4 Disciplines of Execution at my school, and I should have probably read it like a lot of years ago because it's an old book, but I just discovered it. And they've made a new version. So I got my team the new version. I'm using the old version, which was a little awkward when they're like, oh, check out page 57. I was like, that's not my page 57, but not a big deal. So the new version's great, apparently. But one of the things that the book talks quite a bit about is the importance of picking one priority and like naming the one priority that you're going to go after. And I wanted to also just throw that out to this group to see, I think we get in the habit sometimes of saying, great, here's all of the things that we could do. And we're going to have a huge document at the end of this that probably lists all of the things. And I wanted to see sort of whether it's just this discussion or ultimately what comes out of this committee, the level of comfort that we would have in just saying like, this is the one thing that we are going to champion and we are going to like put a stake in the ground on, like as an example, literacy coaches in every classroom or in every school, which would be mine. But I'm just sort of curious, like what the appetite for this group would be of saying, hey, we're going to, by the end of this committee's process, we're going to say, we believe there is one thing that we believe is going to dramatically inform and change the trajectory for our kids. And we get behind that one thing versus saying, here's the 30 different things that could happen within the K-3 literacy space. So anyway, I'm happy to like share kind of how we've thought about that at our district or what potentially this could be, but I would love to know what people's appetite would be for saying, like, this committee is going to hang its hat on this thing because we believe that this has an incredible impact for kids.
Thank you very much for that, for beginning that conversation. If there's one thing that our district has done is hang our hat on literacy coaches. So we have 13 elementary schools. We have a very, very small elementary school out on a military base, but 12 of those 13 schools have a literacy coach on it. K-3 money pays for about 6 of them now, and the district picks up the rest of the tab for the other 6 because our principals have said that is the most important person on our campus when it comes to literacy and having and teaching our kids to read. That you're very true and very right on that.
Thank you, Member Shepherd. Oh, yes, Member Sanchez.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's important to talk about like what are we going to focus in on. I think we should also think about what is the end goal, right? So what are we actually looking for to meet? So if we're looking for our students to show proficiency on the reading portion of the AASA third grade test, then I think we do have to have a conversation about that Mauer cut score. And then we have to kind of like Executive Director Ross mentioned, maybe provide like a framework, and then maybe that stair step kind of progression that Dr. Burke mentioned that Mississippi did as well to kind of get us to that end goal. So I like the idea. I think that we should maybe consider like that strategy moving forward as well. I do have a question though, as to whether or not there has been some kind of analysis that has already been done by maybe accountability with regards to if we were to move the Mauer cut score for just the third grade reading portion, we were to move it to, instead of minimally proficient to proficient, what would that mean for our third graders and the percentage of students who would meet that? So just wondering if that has already been done, some kind of analysis.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, Member Sanchez. So there is not currently, that work has not been done yet. So the psychometricians would need to look at the data and examine sort of where the cut score is historically, how students have met that cut score, how those students have done, kind of what Dr. Burke was talking about, and then map out statistically significant increases. Standard deviation. Sorry, that was the term I was trying to find. And how the projected scores at each. So interestingly, when we reached out to Excel and Ed, we reached out to Dr. Burke and Dr. Hopenitz, who is also on our technical advisory committee for A through F letter grades, and she's wonderful. She's sort of their assessment guru, and we felt like this conversation was first. The idea of seeing what the subcommittee would call for the conditions required for a change in cut score versus having this subcommittee actually dive into the numbers, in particular because that sort of the cut score setting would really have to be done in collaboration. It would have to happen at the board. It would have to be done in collaboration with the board, the legislature, the department, kind of a lot of stakeholders. So really the goal today is for you all to set the conditions you think are required for that to occur more than the sort of psychometrics of it.
Thank you, Sean. And I just want to, I think Vice Chair Meyerson brings up a great point that I think we were hoping when we have our November virtual would be where we either just, have that conversation about prioritization and which key drivers are really rising to the top and looking at that. I just want to remind us that right now we're talking about the conditions of whether a change in Mauer, what conditions, and I'll just throw out some of the conditions that I heard in Dr. Burke's presentation. Really, I mean, I wrote it 3 times, implementation matters, and that we need to not set ourselves up for failure, and we need to set ourselves up for success by, what Mississippi and other states made sure they had in place before they even looked at a change was, scaled training, scaling literacy coaches, more high quality instructional materials where, where they needed to be so that when they could talk about that possible change, then they could know that they had elements of success in place. So I don't know if that's what maybe you were suggesting, Sean, by like a framework of just identifying some of the other things that maybe we heard today, and creating kind of a suggestion of elements of items for success in a framework so that we can look at that instead of, again, we have confusion about where our cut score is. And so maybe one of the elements of that is also when that is explored and when that discussion by another committee is looked at, that they also think about clear definition and clear guidance so that communication about that can be really clear. Because I heard also communication and clear communication and transparency was an important element for success. So just a couple things.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think that I think ultimately we need to do a runway for cut scores. I mean, having the lowest cut score, I don't think is helpful. But to the point of that, yes, we need to look at what conditions are they going to be. And so I'm kind of going all over the place because I think, Member Myerson, I think your point is well taken in that, is there one thing we can look at? And the way I look at it is I think there isn't one thing. There may be one policy ask, but the other thing that I heard from Dr. Burke too is communication, right? I think that after 10 years of Move On When Reading, and you start talking to folks of new administrators, new teachers, I think we have some communication to do about why are we doing what we're doing and what kind of success have we seen through the years? Why have we seen success, and build up the knowledge base from our within our schools as well as policymakers about why this is important, and then start building on. There may be just one policy ask, but I also think that there needs to be a bigger picture than once we have what is, where are we going? And then create that runway on the professional development. I totally agree. I think the department's been great on letters. Maybe the next steps are with administrators, making sure we have that. But I think it's more holistic than that, because there's going to be different levers that we're pulling through it. Some of it's going to be comms, some of it's going to be policy, some of it's going to be administrative, some of it's going to be at the school site level. And if we can get all of that, maybe every single person has one item, but holistically, we now have 20 because we've had the collective impact model to make it work. So.
Chair Clark, I would love to just put a double stamp on the implementation piece. And when we talk about, the group talks about the conditions, is really taking it that next step in terms of the processes and system that are going to be used to monitor, using the example of the literacy coaches, the selection process, criteria to be a coach, support for those coaches. It's a layered implementation piece, but that's where I've seen some states that have put really strong legislation in place have to circle back on the details of the implementation. So just taking your example of the coaches and thinking about all the different steps in that process of job description, expectations, support, monitoring of the work, and who owns each of those pieces. Where is it at the district level, the principal level, the state agency level? So just would invite you, as we contemplate, or you contemplate this framework that's been referenced in the conditions, that there's real thoughtfulness about what I call the implementation, but also the execution, actual execution down into the classroom. So just from experience working with other states, it's worth taking the time to think about that at a fairly detailed level. Just closes a lot of loops that would have to come back to and be closed if not thought of on the front end.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Myerson, members of the subcommittee. Just one other piece of sort of talking about the conditions for success, and thus far a theme through this has been a sort of a runway, right, and a multi-tiered process. It reminded me, and I just had to kind of check my my data with Dr. Burke, but of a state. I'm not going to name the state, but there was a state about 7 years ago at this point, who changed their cut scores one year to the next. They went from a cut score relatively similar to Arizona's to anybody who fell in the minimally proficient range one year to the next, with no change in funding, support, training, or anything. Very suddenly, they had close to half of their third graders as candidates for retention, like in the 40%. They had no methodology for how to prepare for that, how to staff that at a school, how to handle that. People obviously panicked, the community was outraged, and it actually ended their legislation for a while. They ended up pulling it back. So just as a sort of example of what not to do, potentially, again, I won't name the state.
No, thank you, Executive Director Ross. I think that was partly why we framed this as what are the conditions? And one of the conditions is don't set us up for failure by, arbitrarily picking things that we might not have put the pieces into place to be able to reach that goal. And so I appreciate you reminding us of that. So I would add that to our framework in the making of ensuring that things are in place and supports are in place, and then any exploration of any change is done using data, using science, and not using arbitrary. Well, this feels right. Like we need to get we're in the middle of minimally proficient. Should we let's just make it minimally proficient? Like there needs to be a process, and there is a committee in place, and a very well able to handle some of those. But this setting this up for success is a key part of my mental model. Yes. Anybody over here? Anybody over here? Yes. Member Overton.
So I think one thing that we need to be proud of is that we do have so much already put in place. I mean, when you look at this implementation report and you see that we really only have 2 in the red, and I mean, eliminating a 3 queuing system doesn't seem overly hard. I mean, hard to do because the reason we haven't been able to do that is that adoption of the high quality curriculum that's right above that. So we've got the instruction and intervention area that we might need to really focus on. And it looks more like that tier 1 instruction. I think there are some pretty robust interventions for tier 2 and tier 3, but I think tier 1, at least district-wide, and I'm hearing kind of statewide, is still a little bit of a challenge for people to really find what is that quality one. So if we were to, Vice Chair Meyerson's suggestion, one of mine would be a high quality tier 1 curriculum. But then going back on what we really are good at, I think it's really important that we make sure that everybody understands what we're already doing. So that communication, not only for when we make any changes, if we do give any suggestions for changes, but what we're doing right now, because I was just, Member Buttles made the comment that about the individual reading plan. We send on a move on when reading letter to all students below the 29th percentile. That letter outlines much of what the plan was that Dr. Burke was explaining. So we almost have that in place, but teachers haven't necessarily bought into what that actual letter is explaining to parents. They look at it as something that's scaring parents, when it doesn't need to scare parents. It's informing parents of what we're doing to help your student. So I just really think making sure people understand the importance of what we already do have in place and celebrating that we're on the right track.
Yes. Great.
Thank you so much, Chair Clark. I just have a question for you, Member Overton, and even also Member Buttles. Like, thinking about if educators or schools are sending letters home to parents that your kid is at risk for being withheld, or your kid is not meeting grade level, say in 1st or 2nd grade, we have a plan for you. What do you think it would take for an educator of that particular student and or the principal of that school to really buy in, to say, gosh, we want all of our kids to be set up for success. We want all of our kids to be reading on grade level, not because it's like good for our stats, but it's really good for these students so that they can become lifelong learners. What do you think is needed, whether it's through coaching or interventions or additional professional development? What do you think is needed to help those educators and those school leaders to really buy in to and own the sense of educational instruction?
I think firstly, it's not that they don't have that expectation. It's that in the current climate, it feels like teaching has become so much more than just teaching. I can't think of a single teacher who's like, I know that this percent of my class is going to do great. And okay, for those guys, like they want it to happen, but there's a lot of outside factors that are addressing. And I think Member Overton really made it clear with like the conversation we were having with all the things that we're already doing. If teachers don't have that buy-in, they're not gonna jump in. Like I'd spoken before about my involvement with the KEA from start to finish, and how a lot of teachers are like, oh, it's just so much, but they didn't see the power behind it. And I think some of it is coming from the attitude of their admin or district leadership to say, this is really incredible. Here's what it really is. And I think the coaching and support will help, because as a classroom teacher, it's like, okay, do this and 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 do this. Even though you do some of it over here, it feels like it's an avalanche of stuff that you can't really get down to the nitty gritty of it. Like Member Overton said, there is a lot of great stuff that teachers and admin and district and state are doing, but it's very disjointed. I think if we could find a way to connect it all together and get everybody in the right frame of mind, that would really help.
To maybe just to clarify a little bit, I think Member Sanchez, you mentioned it a little bit, like, and I think Dr. Burke, you mentioned it in your presentation, like, do we need to sort of have like a rubric or have sort of a guidance, and maybe it already exists, but have a guidance of like, instead of all the things that you do these things, sort of going to Member Meyerson's comment, like do the one thing, do it really, really well, and sort of be singularly focused rather than ad hoc. I do a little bit of this, I do a little bit of that, and perhaps it all adds up. Are in some ways, is that what you are suggesting, Member Buttles, is just sort of really help instead of adding multiple layers, saying we're going to do this one thing and this is what it looks like in a comprehensive way, rather than doing a little bit over here and a little bit over there?
I think in a perfect world, yes, but no. And that's the conversation. I can't remember who had said it with, like, literacy coaches should only be doing literacy coaches and not playground duty and cafeteria duty and that sort of thing. But in the boots on the ground, and four people are out, like, we're going to do what's best right now, physically, safely for kids, versus in the long run, we know the instruction is the most important, but sometimes things have to be shifted. I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did.
I'm going to ask, you've heard some of our conversation and you have to leave, but is there any last parting words based on what you're hearing as you should get Vis some guidance?
Yes. So I wanted to say about the, I talked so much earlier, about focusing on what you're doing. I think that the communication should be around what you're doing is the business of school. We want you to make sure that if you're screening students, you're using the right tools to get the information that we need. Some of it with teaching is, oh, I want to thank you. Some of it is, I'll say this. We had some feedback from districts that was saying the state is making us give all these assessments. And there was this group that said, you know what, I want to test that theory. Because the state only requires universal screening 3 times per year. And then, of course, best practices with your diagnostic assessments and with those things. Districts were requiring additional testing. Some districts were saying, we're going to test every Friday, whether the teacher's been here all week, whether the students have been here all week, we're going to test. So that report showed us that there were just some practices within districts that were causing a lot of angst. And I was on this community meeting with the state. I mean, there was a pastor, there was a teacher, because there was a representative. It was like, listen, before I champion this, I need you to talk to my folks. Okay, great. There was a teacher who was also a parent who said, listen, my child is being assessed with iReady. My child is being assessed with STAR. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, well, those two do the same thing. Like, why is your child being tested? Right. So there are also some things that we, within the district, when we talk about the levels, we have to take stock of whether this is just common practice, and we've always done it, or because TNTP also says, I forgot her name. I'm better. Addition by subtraction. Like, how do we get rid of things that just aren't working in order to add the things that we know work? And I think that some of that work has to be done at the school level, at the building level as well, but with guidance and support, right? The other thing is, and I have a question really, and Member Sanchez, you may be able to help me with that. What is your avenue for getting out information? For example, Sean said, oh, we've passed a rule already around a retest. Who else knows that? You know, like, oh, there are supports that are supposed to happen in fourth grade. Who else knows that besides us in this room now and anybody who happens upon this on like YouTube or something? Like, who else knows that? What's your avenue for that? Alabama now has their Alabama Reimagined Conference, where you get to learn more about the law, but you also get like national speakers and all of this. Mississippi has our Mississippi Literacy Association conference every year now. We also have regional meetings. We also have parent meetings, like in 8 different parts of I think it's now 6 different parts of the state. So how do you get this information out? I talked to another state. I remember talking to California, and there was this deputy who said, oh, we have a plan. Like, we've done our plan. We've done all of this. And I said, oh, like, where is it? She said, on our website. I said, who else knows besides you? Like, and whoever else helped you to do this amazing plan that you all had. And so that was just kind of a point of, you're right. Like, we're doing these things. And like you said, there are things to applaud. Couple that with the other things that need to be done. And what avenues do you have here in Arizona? Do you have a statewide conference for teachers? We also have a conference like our superintendent's conference, MAS, that they go to every summer where they learn about new policies, whether it's legislative or board policies. How do you get these things out to those who are on the ground? And I was in a state that had recently passed a law. It had been passed for maybe a year. And I was talking to teachers at a conference. And I said, your state just passed a law. What's in it? And I had a microphone. And I got an audience and I was just walking around. There were only a few people who could say, oh, well, I think we screeners. Like, I think we're doing screeners. And somebody else was like, we've been doing professional development. Like, they don't know. For the people who are actually doing the work, they may not even know what the expectations are, or think that by next year or the year after, the expectations will be gone. So how do we message that, no, this is what we're doing, but this is also how we're helping you?
Yeah. Yes, please.
So thank you for bringing up that important question. That has been something that has been on my mind the last year that I've been at the department as well, with how do we get this information out to the field? And so it's almost as though, and I'll be quite honest, as though they're siloed out depending on whichever department or team has that particular communication with the field. And so I know for this last retake of our AASA, I did reach out to assessments department. They have their own newsletter and their own like office hours. I met with their group that meets, and then I invited them to join with our ELA team during our office hours and put that on our newsletter. So it's basically our team that's reaching out to our listservs that we have of the field, which, changes from year to year. And so we have to really be thoughtful on, well, who are the contacts for this year? And, thankfully with our literacy plan submissions, all that contact information comes in to us. So then we're able to update our listserv as well, to send out those emails, to have those newsletters be sent, to have those office hours as well. And, we do have our different conferences throughout Arizona, again, that are led by different teams or different departments within the agency. And so if you are part of that conference, then you would then be able to communicate to the people that are there, what are the new legislative changes or policy changes and so on. But there isn't I wouldn't say, just in my opinion, I think it probably needs to be streamlined a bit more.
I'll say this and I'm headed out. Consider a virtual conference. Consider next year or whatever it is, whenever it is, hosting a virtual conference that, because California Reading Coalition sponsors theirs. The topics range, right? There are a variety of topics, but this will be a way where you can partner with other departments to say if there's something you want to get out or something we want to get out. We're also going to have a speaker. We're also going to have like these other kind of sessions around building knowledge even. So not just a policy based, we're going to talk about all the policies, but yes, one of them is a general session could be what are the updates to move on when reading, right? And then the other sessions can be around other things like what are interventions, what are the best ways to do this. But a virtual conference, even if it's a half day or something to get everybody in the virtual room to begin sharing out some information, because the one-offs, you know, you can hear something at this conference and then you hear something else somewhere else and all of that, and partner with some of your colleagues to do that. And I can talk to you more about it. Yep. All right, y'all. I gotta
Safe
go.
travels.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to check in with you, Executive Director Ross, because we still have item 5 to get to, or should we table that to November?
Member Clark, Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the subcommittee. Like any good teacher, we overplanned. And so that item was always sort of a break glass if needed, knowing that this conversation would probably potentially take the whole meeting. So we have space in the November meeting for item 5. Absolutely.
Thank you. So I think we can just, if there's any last comments or Member Canto, if I just always, you know, aware of the virtual participation is challenging. So please, if you have any thoughts to share, maybe we wrap up last thoughts on this this item around the conditions needed to even explore potential change in the cut score, and then we'll table item 5 to our November virtual. But I will encourage members to really, you got these weeks ago, the recommendations that we'll be then considering adopting in November. So please get very familiar with them so that we can, there's a lot to accomplish in that November meeting. And this is just one thing, but there's we had A through K. So that's almost half the alphabet. So anything, Member Canto, or anything last sort of wrap up thoughts from today's presentation and speakers and data and discussion from anyone?
If I may,
Please.
I did appreciate everything that I heard today, particularly our guest speaker, and was in agreement with many of the comments the members were just providing. I loved our guest speaker's suggestion about a virtual conference, because I do think, as a couple members mentioned, the communication part is super important. And sometimes it feels like if you miss this conference, or you didn't go to that conference, then there's holes in the information that you receive. And I was listening to the presentation and talking comments about implementation, and that requires fidelity and consistency. So unless there's some consistent communication or consistency among the professional development, whether that's for staff, coaches, or admin, then I think those would be some problems if some of those conditions are not in place moving forward for success. So those would be my remarks.
Yeah, I just, you know, because I really appreciate Dr. Burke's comments, and then Tiana, about just really the different conferences and whatnot. I mean, what just is really hitting me though so much is that we've been doing this for some time. And I think that the buy-in, you know, Member Buttles, of what you've talked about, obviously, Member Overton, of if you get the buy-in, you have it. There's a lot of stuff that is working, but I think we have to like think about some of the mindset issues of this is not compliance driven. This is really about what we're doing for students and for student success. Because I think if we stay in a compliance model, we're always going to be just like we're checking boxes. Okay, we have this, but it's not we're not going to get to the place we need to be. And we're not, because it's going to seem like still something that's being done to people rather than being part of the system. And so I don't have the answer to it, but I just think about even the conferences. It's really, and heck, I did it for, 16 years at the school boards. It's just like, here's all the data dump to somebody, but you're not necessarily getting the buy-in or the conversation, which is what really matters. So I think it's a good idea. I just don't think it's the total answer. I think there's something else that needs to go on there.
I'd like to add on to what Member Palmer just said. I really like the idea of a virtual conference. I think a lot of times teachers really want the learning. And I know myself as a teacher, I went above and beyond what was offered, to seek out my own. And the idea of a virtual conference, I think is a great idea because a lot of time it's the cost. It's the conferences cost a lot because they're not where you are and you have to pay for gas and travel and food and lodging and all that thing. So it feels like it's very cost prohibitive for most teachers. So the idea of a virtual conference is very appealing to me.
Just one more. When Member Haley asked, what do teachers need? I don't know the exact background from this, and we won't have time to get onto this right now, but we have such a high focus and hyper focus of that term dyslexia. And a lot of times those letters that go out, that's all a teacher or a parent sees is just dyslexia. And it heightens the panic as opposed to we're doing this not just because of dyslexia. We're doing this because it's what's best for students. So I don't know. I mean, when you say, what do we need? Maybe we need a better explanation as to why in the last 4 or 5 years that dyslexia term has come. And then when they hear dyslexia, they think that's special education. They don't understand, right? They don't understand that can be tier 1, that can be tier 2. So just a lot of clarification and communication, which could be hit through some of those virtual conferences.
Thank you. So I think you have more than enough notes captured, and we're going to table item 5, which was from last meeting, some of the recommendations that the committee will consider, but we'll do that at a future meeting. And so the last item on the agenda is about future meeting dates and items for future agendas. Our committee meeting is virtual, the next one, and is tentatively, or not tentatively, is scheduled for Wednesday, November 6th at 9 a.m. But I know some are concerned about that date. So Member Meyerson, I'll let you share.
I just realized it's the day after the election. And so I'm thinking we might want to adjust that just given all the things.
Well said. Vice Chair Clark, or Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson. That's a great idea. I will work with you all to identify some other dates that could work. Just to ask the subcommittee, maybe just a show of hands, would you like that next meeting to stay virtual? Okay, so yes, okay. Let's keep it virtual just in case, because it is the holidays. It's kind of a crazy time for school folks, especially. But I will look for another date outside of November 6th. Also, that's a good segue. We had initially scheduled that meeting for 2 hours. We're going to make it 3. I think there's definitely enough to cover there. All the things.
Just one point, and I know I'll be in the minority, but that's okay. I will feel better. The reason why I just suggest an in-person is because the number of items that we're going to be going through, I think it's going to be very challenging to do that in a virtual environment and make sure that we really have, back to the buy-in, making sure that we really have buy-in on the recommendations that we do provide to the state board. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot. Well, it's a lot. Because I think this is so important, and this is probably the most important meeting because it is what we're going to recommend, that it just gives me pause of how I know we have a fearless leader that you'll be able to do it, but I think it's very challenging to do that many in a virtual environment.
And we can certainly schedule it in person with there's always a virtual option. So.
Be okay with that? Okay, perfect. All right. Anything else? Our real fearless leader, Executive Director Ross?
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Meyerson, members of the subcommittee. As has happened in the past, I know I said this already, but I just want to clarify because this one will look a little different. Board staff will put together what we've heard today, vet it through leadership in the subcommittee. Once we have sort of consensus and approval, we'll send it out to everybody as early as possible so that you have it in hand to really look at and review prior to when we schedule the next meeting. And then just as a reminder, I'll actually attach both docs so that they're at the top of your email. But just as a reminder, we had also sent out the recommendations from last month to look at. So yeah, and we'll try to get creative in sort of how we do this for maybe a more efficient look at the list. So just expect that in your email inbox. Soon's a strong word.
All right. Well, with that, I will call this meeting adjourned at 11:51. And thank you, everybody, for your great time and great discussion.